Welcome to Dive into Young Politics. Sorry for that little bit of mishap there. Things are always a little hard coming from the field. So, as I was saying, we're doing a little bit different of Dive into Young Politics today. We've got a discussion with Trip Frank and Spencer Calhoun, two of our Young Democrats of Michigan board members who both do a lot of work in their communities. And we're going to look at the elections that just happened last week. And then we're going to talk about some legislation that's upcoming. I'm sorry that my video is not working. I'm coming live to you from the Kellogg factory where I'm out supporting the striking workers with Spencer. And so we're going to make it at work. So, Trip, if you want to take it away and kind of jump into the topic. And Spencer, I'm hoping you can hear us. We will get started.
Great. I guess, Leah, do you want to talk about stuff that happened nationally, or do you want to start in Michigan first on the election front? We had a lot of.
Let's start local and move up.
Okay, that's a great way. That's a good place to start. So obviously, we had municipal elections here in Michigan. The most important of those being the Detroit city elections, and we saw some really interesting things. Well, we did see citywide officials like Jan Winfrey and Mayor Mike Duggan be reelected by large majorities. It was the city council where we saw a lot more turnover. Of the nine people who are going to serve on the Detroit City Council come next year, 6 of those are going to be new faces. We saw 2 incumbents lose their seats as well, which showed that voters were looking for maybe a fresh change of pace, which doesn't surprise us that much. There's been a lot of news in the last, especially 6 months, about corruption and investigations by the Federal Bureau of Investigation looking into what is going on with the Detroit City Council. So voters were clearly in a, toss them out kind of mood. We saw Roy McAllister go down in District 2. We saw Jamie Ayers, whose house had been raided earlier this year. No charges have been filed against her, but her house was raided. Also lose to Mary Waters and Coleman Young II in the city council at large races. So we're going to be faced with a city council that's a lot of new faces. That is always a very interesting thing. Mayor Duggan, he's going to be entering into his 3rd term. He needs the city council to work with him if he wants to get some of his agenda passed. And seeing how he deals with the city council is going to be really important. I think the other thing that really struck me was the voter apathy is still very much an issue here in the city of Detroit. Less than 2 in 10 voters showed up to vote in a citywide election. Obviously, there wasn't a lot of competition going on at the top of the ticket, as we saw Mayor Duggan advance pretty easily. But some of those city council seats in District 6, District 4, District 2, the city at large seats were really some of the ones that we saw some really competitive campaigning on. So voters in Detroit are still looking for someone. I think they're unhappy with their choices. 8 out of 10 of those voters are not showing up on election day. So we will continue to see this. It's an interesting trend. On Tuesday, the message of Detroit sent was that they are sick and tired of kind of the corruption and get along to go along policies that's been going on. And they tossed out city council, and we're going to have a new city council next year. That should bring a lot of excitement.
Yeah, I think that we saw some of that same energy in a lot of other communities. I think about in, Dearborn and Pontiac, they were electing a new mayor either way, but their city council in Pontiac was entirely brand new. So every person that was elected in city council, we're still waiting on results from District 7. It was a write-in campaign for District 7, but of the 6 districts that are in, we saw all new candidates be elected. So I think some of that what you're referring to that we're talking about is, people want change. They want new faces. They're tired of what hasn't been working. And so we saw some pretty big wins in some of these key cities where people really are just tired of it and they want change. They want something new.
Yeah, and I think also we saw when it comes to new, it was going to the well. It was going to new faces. We saw for the first time there will be Arab American mayors in both Dearborn Heights, and Hamtramck, all elected their first Arab mayors. I think that's a pretty big deal, especially in the Arab community. That's something they're touting as a successful night. We saw people win up and down the ballot in Oakland County and Macomb. And even in areas where you don't see as much traditional kind of Democrat strength, we saw that. The Kentwood mayoral race came down to the wire out in the Grand Rapids suburb. That's an area that's traditionally considered a very Republican area of the state up until the last couple of years. And that one was a much closer race than I think a lot of people predicted. So definitely, it is not just going back to the same faces over and over again. It's looking for new faces and new ideas that are really interesting. So I think that's another thing to look at on this the citywide level. Another thing I wanted to talk about was I think there were some really interesting city council initiatives that we saw being promulgated up and down the ballot. We saw the city of Detroit vote for Proposition R, which was going to explore the acts of reparation in the city of Detroit, which would be a huge step forward possibly for the city. So the voters are definitely giving us we are no longer satisfied with how things are going. We want change message, across the state and frankly across the country.
Yeah, definitely. Spencer, what do you feel like you've seen in your area over this last election while?
In some of the smaller races, I've seen candidates who campaigned really hard, but they lost by 20 votes. There are people who've lost by fewer than 100 votes. And so I've seen, just with this past election on a smaller scale, how important direct voter contact is and that get out the vote is, because these elections were very, very close. And it could have been different outcomes for people who did a little bit more get out the vote. Obviously, some of them were working as hard as they could. But from my outsider perspective, getting out that vote closer to the end, getting people to the polls, that really could change some of these elections over to wins.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that comes back to that voter turnout that we were talking about. I know in Pontiac, the last time I looked, I was a campaign manager for those watching in Pontiac. So that's kind of where I spent most of my time. And the turnout, I think, was last I checked, 12% of the city turned out for the election. And we have to find a way to increase that number because so many good races are coming down to just a few votes. And it's a game on at the poll voters and absentee voters, and I think something that we are seeing more and more is that increase in absentee voters, and that changes the game for a lot of us organizers and campaigners. Is GOTV becomes so much earlier now, and I think that's something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to going into 2022.
Absolutely, and I think, and we will talk about this, I'm sure, later on with Spencer. Absentee voting is something that more and more voters in the state of Michigan are getting comfortable with. They like the fact of having a ballot mailed to your house, being able to fill it out at your convenience and send it back in. I think, so many people, they've got jobs, they've got family, they've got things going on. Absentee ballot, I think the proportion of absentee ballots in these municipal elections was a lot higher than I think some people were expecting. So I think going forward into 2022, 2024, we should definitely not be surprised to see more and more voters choosing to vote by mail.
Yeah, definitely. For District 3, where our vice chair and someone who's been on the show, Mikal Goodman, ran, 218 of those votes in a really small voter turnout district were absentee votes. And it was just barely more for day of votes. Absentee was a really big deal. And that's just in a tiny district. As we go into looking at statewide stuff coming up this next election cycle, each area kind of has different trends, but I think we're going to see a huge increase in absentee, especially as we don't know what things are going to look like for jobs, for COVID, for all these other reasons. For senior citizens, absentee is just becoming the choice to go with. It's faster, it's safer, you can do your research at home. And I think that we're going to have to, as campaigns, adjust, and we're going to have to start our GOTV earlier. I think what Spencer is saying is, if you're not doing that GOTV, you're going to lose out on those critical votes. And I think absentee GOTV is an area that we can improve on.
Absolutely. I will say there was something very telling that I read a couple days ago that I think we talk a lot. We're going to talk later about the efforts by Republicans in voter suppression. But if you remember a year ago when they were counting absentee ballots in Detroit, it was down at the TCF Center. And you had all these protesters swarming on the doors and banging and let us in. It looked like the Brooks Brother riot back in Florida in 2000. There was a reporter who went down to the TCF Center on election night this year. Not a single Republican observer showed up. So, I think that gives away the game a little bit, so that, when it's elections they care about, or, when it's the city of Detroit helping elect a candidate they choose statewide, then it's, we have to be there to make sure there's no fraud. But, in a year where we're hearing the big lie and all this stuff, not having a single, person coming down to Detroit to be a legal observer, which is the right of the party, I think that is very telling.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. And I those voter suppression bills, I guess we can touch on those now. what I like to say is, our democracy works best when as many voters as possible are voting, right? So, like, we've increased access to the vote through Proposition 3, which allowed for no reason absentee voting. But we're seeing a lot of things come under attack. And luckily we do have a Democratic governor right now who will likely veto these types of things, but other states are also seeing these efforts and they may not be in the same position as us. What are you guys seeing on that front with the sort of efforts that are coming away for voter suppression, both from Lansing and also throughout the nation, just kind of that narrative?
Well, in Lansing, I think the Republicans are still, just like you said, on this whole election protection scheme that they've been up to. And especially, too, I see just in the communities, the petitions that they've put out, Secure My Vote, I think they're called. And what they're doing is, it's really wild because I've seen this a lot too. They're so concerned about protecting the vote by having strict ID requirements, strict requirements like that. But to sign the petition to put these in place, they don't check your ID. They don't check to make sure you live in this place where you're signing the petition. And so you can kind of see where they're coming from. They aren't really trying to secure the vote. I think we all know that. But it's coming from a place with a lot of these other bills that we've seen come up. It's coming from, a place where they're just trying to get in power, and they're really willing to take any steps necessary, even being completely hypocritical to make it happen.
I agree with Spencer. I think a great example of this was in Virginia. The Democratic legislature last year had passed a raft of new bills that expand the right to vote, that that rolled back some of the strict voter ID requirements, that allowed for a lot more vote by mail and early voting in the state of Virginia, and the Republicans won. And someone asked a state senator there named Amanda Chase, who's who wants to audit the state, who's been kind of very caught up in that election, what they're calling election protection, was suppress the vote efforts. Said, okay, well, Senator Chase, are we going to? This was a much closer race than the state was the last year. Do we need to audit this one as well? And she's like, oh no, this election was secure, but we still need to audit 2020. So of course, it's when we win, nothing went wrong, everything is fine, business as usual. But when the other side wins, oh well, clearly there must be fraud. So it's Spencer said it's hypocritical, it's disingenuous, and it just shows you that Republicans are like, oh, we need to protect the vote. Republicans can win in open, fair elections.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have candidates, they raise money, but all these do is to hurt our democracy, undermine faith in it, and make it harder for everyone to make their voice heard. And I think that's the most frustrating part.
And when it is easier to vote, when people can do it in advance using voting by mail, when it's easier to get to your voting precinct if you prefer to do it that way, that changes the game. And I think Republicans are aware that the number of people whose votes are being suppressed are the most affected by these measures. And so, yeah, just like it's been said, it's very disingenuous. It's not about protecting any vote, securing any election. It's about protecting power. And they're doing that by disenfranchising voters, the very voters that they claim to be protecting.
Yeah, I do think that hypocrisy is a pretty good term for what we're seeing. It's really hypocritical. And, with the petitions that are circulating, something that we need to do is educate people on them. Make sure that when people walk up to you and say, we're giving you a petition to protect your vote, that we've spoken to those people and told them, hey, this really isn't what they're claiming it is. Because those petitions are going to be out there. They're going to be at big events and they're going to market them as protect the vote. And, isn't that something you care about? But like the truth behind the bills is it really is just more voter disenfranchisement. And, this is their way of trying to circumnavigate the fact that these bills weren't going to pass, weren't going to be signed by the governor. Now they're going to start a petition. I could branch out and say that we're seeing sore loser attitudes at this point.
Well, I think it's disingenuous. I think it is disingenuous to say that when the governor of Michigan, Governor Whitmer, is elected with over 2.5 million votes, that only 10% of that, 254 signatures, can override the veto of a governor who was elected by 10 times that much. You know, the people of Michigan were given a choice in 2018, and they clearly chose Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And they gave her they know giving her the power to veto legislation. So the Republicans can bring their legislation. They can either try to override the veto, which they know they will lose because they don't have the votes, or they can try to elect a Republican governor. But to go around and use 10% to use a petition to get around the governor's veto, getting only 10% of what the governor received is a disingenuous way to keep power and to undermine our democracy by saying, well, you know, as long as a small portion of our base wants it, then we're good. And that's it spits in the face of what the builders of Michigan chose to do. If you can't win an election, you have to come back in 2, 4, 6 years and try again and try a different approach. But we've seen this elsewhere too, where Democrats have won attorney generalships, they've won governorships, they've won offices, and the outgoing Republican legislatures have used their power to strip those offices of power they traditionally had because of Democrats coming to power. Because, well, we use that power, but how dare we can't let those people use that power? We need to rein in it's hypocrisy.
And, I think you brought up a good point, too. It is worrisome that, okay, we've taken it to, the state house. It passed how it did. It's vetoed. But then people are, you're going to see, if you look at the people who are signing this, people who all have the same mindset. They all want the same thing. We're signing this petition. That's the very nature of the petition. But not everyone's voice is getting heard. And they're using that to hold on to the power and only pushing their voice. And no one else's voice is going to be heard using the process that they're trying to jam us through with.
I will be interested in this signature once the signature process is completed. What's the percentage of signatures they got in District 1, 2, District 4 on the west side of the state versus in District 13, District 14, District 11, I think, is the Dearborn seat. Leah, don't quote me on that.
12 is still a Dearborn.
Well, I'm sorry. 12 is the Dearborn Ann Arbor seat. I will be interested to see what the proportion of signatures is for that. I think that will be very telling.
Yeah, I would agree that where the signatures come from will be very telling as to what it is. And one of the things that's so frustrating is this is really a partisan battle, right? And so we have to spend our time defending the vote when we should be really focused on a lot of other issues that are impacting us. I think about a lot of the campaigns that just happened, and their issues were so about the people, but now we're spending so much energy battling about keeping our votes secure, and not having voter suppression become a law and part of just how things work. It's really frustrating sometimes that we're spending so much energy trying to defeat these things that, like you're saying, is circumnavigating, is very hypocritical. And it's useful when it's a Republican in charge, and then it's horrible and evil when it's a Democrat in charge. And these are just powers that are given to these positions regardless of your partisan alignment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I kind of lost my train of thought, but yeah, just that. It's very concerning that the legislature can't get to the business it needs to conduct because of all this disagreement on an already safe process. They're trying to fix problems that don't exist, while the problems that do exist are tearing people apart. And I can't think of anything worse for a representative form of government, where your representatives and your senators say, "Oh no, hold on, we know you've got this problem, but we're going to fix this problem. It doesn't exist, and we might get around to your problem later." It's just not right. And a lot of representatives are ready to get back to just working to do what they were elected to do, to help people, not to stop people from voting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think about a lot of the people who just got elected, and some of them are in positions where they're going to have boards that actually work well together and things are going to get done. And then you have others that are in positions where it's still really divisive. And, you might be screaming into the void for a little bit longer. And that's really frustrating. Like, that's difficult. But a lot of them are ready to get to the issues that matter and stop having to fight so many partisan battles.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting. I think municipal government is always a very local politics can sometimes be the sharpest. But I think that we, especially in the last year or so, when we've seen the Biden administration come down with these major pieces of legislation, we just saw one get passed last night, the infrastructure bill, that's going to be millions of dollars to local and county governments to do things that they may not have before. I think it's really those board positions are more important now than ever before because they're going to be dealing with funds that are going to be affecting their communities. And I think we are I think we in the movement often get concerned about who's running for president, who's running for senator. Those school board seats, those city council seats, they make a lot of really important decisions in your life too. They control they control what businesses go in, they control schools, they control does a park get built in your neighborhood, they control as we've learned very horribly, they control your water supply, and that can be really bad, especially what we're seeing what happened in Flint, what is possibly developing down in Benton Harbor. Those roles are just as important, and I think that preserving that we have people who are fighting for every person, just not the special interest, up and down those things is important. Even having people there serving as watchdogs is so important on having those councils and city seats.
Definitely. In Washtenaw County, a lot of attention has been drawn towards the county commissioners and the trustees in Ypsilanti Township because of some of the relief money that came in through COVID, the American Rescue Plan. There's a lot more attention right now on who our electeds are and what the powers they now have and the type of money they're now overseeing and where is that going and which area is getting what resources. And there's a lot of pressure being put on the officials to spend wisely, which it should be. But, attention that I don't think you saw on a local trustee or on a county commissioner is now on them going into an election cycle, which I think is really important to notice because it's going to have to put people in a higher level of accountability than I think some of these people have been used to. And it's also drawing more attention to these races because community members are going, well, where is this resources going? Is it going to what I need? And they're getting involved.
I think that's a really good point. You've seen in a number of counties across the state, when they get funds and where they put them has a lot to say about, you could almost guess what the county commission looks like, for instance. When they get this money and it all goes to, or most of it goes to one part of the county. And while the problems that are still happening, this money is intended to solve some of these problems, it's not going to that sometimes. And I think that, like you said, what's on top of some of these upcoming races, some of these past races, or some of the bigger ticket offices, these county commissioners, city commissioners, or city council members, township trustees, all eyes need to be on them and how they've been spending these local dollars, because that directly affects our everyday life. And if we see that they're neglecting the people that they're elected to serve, that can't happen. And we need to find someone who's going to actually take care of their people. But yeah, keeping an eye on that is really important because that money is a good determiner of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think it shows where people's priorities are. If you're always agreeing to funnel money to one area and you're forgetting this other area of your community, why are you doing that? Is that the impoverished area of your community? Is that the majority color area of your community? Is that like the students in your community? And then that really shows where their priorities lie. And, those are things that we need to call them out for coming into this next election cycle. We were talking about how much change we saw in places like Detroit and City Council and Pontiac and City Council with the mayoral decision in Dearborn. That momentum needs to continue into these local elections that are available in 2022.
Absolutely. Do we want to pivot to the national elections, or do we want to?
Yeah, definitely. So, Trip, I know you've been following the national elections pretty heavily. I'm sure you have some updates for us. What would you like to tackle first?
We'll tackle Virginia first, since that is close to my heart in many ways. I've managed multiple campaigns in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and especially in the Northern Virginia area. And Tuesday night was not good for me, as Leah can personally attest to.
Yeah.
Um, obviously, we so Virginia is one of two states. The other is New Jersey, which we'll talk about in a second. That has presidential governor elections a year after presidential elections. And the thing you have to know about Virginia is that we only allow our governors to serve one 4-year term. They can serve multiple terms non-consecutively, but you get 1 4-year term, and then you're out. So the current governor, Governor Ralph Northam, who people may remember for the incident where he was wearing blackface, was not going to be allowed to run again for re-election. The Democrats actually chose his predecessor, a gentleman named Terry McAuliffe, who had a long time to the DNC, to the kind of national politics. The joke was he was Bill Clinton's best friend for a while. But he had served as governor fairly well for 4 years, and the Democrats decided to nominate him over a couple other candidates. And he was running against a gentleman named Glenn Youngkin, who was he's an investor. He founded a wealthy investment company worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. He's more wealthier than the DeVosses, possibly. I'm not sure. But this was going to be a race. And the Republicans, took back the governorship. They won the open lieutenant governor seat. They defeated the attorney general, who had been the attorney general for the last 8 years, and that was seen as a big upset, since Biden had won the state by 10 points just a year ago. The Republicans also succeeded in taking back the House of Delegates, which is the lower house in the Virginia legislature. The Democrats had a 55-45 advantage. That is now 52-48 Republican. So there was not a lot to be very happy on about Virginia that night. I will say that there are some historical facts that should probably be put in place. In the last 13 gubernatorial elections in the state of Virginia, the party that wins the presidency always loses the governor's election the next year. So when President Obama won in 2008, the Democrats then lost the seat in 2009. When President Bush won in 2001 and 2005, he won Virginia, and he won in Virginia overwhelmingly. Those years he ran, Democrats won the governorship in 2001 and 2009. Now, to be fair, the only time that has ever been broken was when Terry McAuliffe was elected in 2013, when he defeated the Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli the year before Barack Obama had won the state and won the presidency. So, it is not a perfect 1-to-1. I won't lie, but 12 out of the last 13 elections, the party that has won the presidency usually loses the governor's office.
That's so interesting to me, because you assume that, let's say the Democrats, for instance, have shored up their support in Virginia and should be able to continue that support. Makes me wonder what the fall off is there, and if it's just the fact that there is such a high turnout for presidential versus governorship, or something else happening there.
Yeah, so I think it's just kind of a natural reaction usually to the one party is in power, the other party is very fired up. Virginia has very interesting politics. It's much more dependent on the federal government than most states are, just because of its proximity to Washington, D.C. You cross the Potomac from Washington, you're in Virginia, and you've got a lot of federal government employees and people who livelihood depend on the federal government, who live in those Northern Virginia suburbs. So they're always very kind of attuned to what's going on in Washington with national politics. I will say I don't think, and I say this as someone who's worked for Terry McAuliffe, I don't think he ran the best campaign. I think, he was very focused on turning Glenn Youngkin into Trump, which on paper looks good because, Trump lost the state by 10 points. Unfortunately, Glenn Youngkin isn't Trump. He doesn't tweet at 2 a.m. He doesn't, he says some pretty radical stuff, but he's able to code this in what I would call a Mitt Romney-like coding. So Trump language, but just coded very nicely like Mitt Romney. And I think Democrats struggled to find an issue that they really divided them on. I think they did, they had done a lot in the last 4 years, especially with the legislature that they gained control of 2 years earlier, and it was frustrating. They struggled to get a message across to voters, and unfortunately, that cost them that.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that what you just said is so important is the messaging that the campaigns have and connecting with issues that matter. I mean, again, I'm going to go back to a local race here, but the difference between really being issue driven and just running a race are very different that we've seen, especially locally. And it sounds like it's something that they failed to do in Virginia is connect with those issues that mattered.
yeah, I mean, voters want to know, what are you going to do with my schools? What are you going to do with my roads? What are you going to do with my taxes? Um, what's going on with social services? I think those are what voters care about. I mean, I think no one in Virginia will deny that Donald Trump is a kind of a looming figure in this whole spectrum. He's lost. He may run again in 2024, but voters are more concerned about what's going on in their day-to-day life than what's happening with the clown of Mar-a-Lago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the message for Democrats, especially as we approach the governor election here in Michigan in 2022, where the legislature will have congressional elections, we'll have the 3 statewide officers up, is really you got to focus on the bread and butter issues. Governor Whitmer won on fix the damn roads. Excuse my language, but she never she didn't talk about Trump. She didn't talk about saying that Bill shooting was this. She was saying we're going to fix the roads and we're going to focus on the issues, and that appealed to voters. That resonated. She had a very successful. She's the most successful Democratic candidate in this state since Barack Obama. So I think that's a clear message to voters, and from the voters to candidates, is that it's not just about Trump versus whoever. It is about what are the issues they're focusing on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that when it comes down to going to the 2022 elections, if we get caught up into a big giant media thing and get away from those bread and butter issues, we may see losses throughout the state.
Exactly, and you don't want to set back. You want to set yourself back. You want to be able to move forward.
I think you're right about that. Staying sticking with issues that are pertinent to the state is super important. I do think that one of the mistakes, possibly this is just in my own mind, one of the mistakes possibly that Terry made was he had gotten on the national level and kind of came back to the state level, but was still kind of focused on the national level. I think that looking at Michigan, statewide offices, focusing on the issues that affect us here at home and fixing those is really the key.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I really agree. So, speaking of those issues, what do we feel like are some things in the legislature right now that we should be looking at following that we think are going to be prevalent going into the 2022 cycle? I know that we have some lame duck situations coming. People who are termed out won't be able to rerun, so lots of new seats. There's a lot happening. What do you think are some of those issues that we're sort of alluding to, but directly addressing yet, that are going to be those bread and butter issues for the people of Michigan?
I think people in Michigan are still very concerned. I think we're very concerned about healthcare, just in general. People are very that I've talked to who are young like me are scared to go to their doctor because they're on their own. They don't understand how insurance works. They don't understand if they're going to have to pay out of pocket, and they know that if they have to pay out of pocket, they can't afford it. On the state level, people are afraid of that. I think, there's tons of other things, but that one comes to my mind. People are, as we've mentioned before, concerned about voting rights, keeping those so that their voice is heard. And then I know that things like broadband, making sure that money is distributed out to places that it needs to happen. Things like that on the state level are super important. Transportation as well. Regional transportation, that's a huge one.
Absolutely. I think 2 other issues I think are definitely going to come into play is education. I think in the last couple of years, because of the pandemic and the schools being closed for a while, and then the reopening, and teachers being frustrated with the lack of their pay is still not very competitive. statewide and other things. I think people are still very concerned about education. Michigan for the last 10, 15 years has been a real concern about brain drain and losing the best and brightest out of the state. But I think, how are we addressing our public schools and how are we making sure that we prepare our students and that they're getting the attention they need after what arguably wasn't a great school year in 2019 because of the pandemic, is how we're supporting our teachers and our students. And I think education is going to be a really big issue. I think another issue is going to still be water. We are still seeing the impacts of the Flint water crisis, reverberate today. Governor Snyder is under indictment for a misdemeanor over his handling of the Flint water issue and may face further prosecution. There's a potential crisis bubbling up in Benton Harbor about lead in the water as well. I think that's still, I think, going to be very much front and center on voters' minds going forward. I think, especially with this infrastructure bill that is coming down, that's going to hopefully replace a lot of these lead pipings in old cities and towns. I think especially voters who have been more at risk of this, we'll see that. We had the flooding in Midland just last year there where the Midland Dam failed. And so I think that whether it's water and lead, whether it's flooding, and we've seen that also, we've seen flooding in Detroit and the greater Southeast Michigan area as well. I think water everywhere. It's going to be on people's minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think water goes further. We think about consent, polluter pay, and PFAS. My environmentalism is coming out here, but and especially being the state of Michigan, we'll definitely hear about Line 5 again. Dana Nessel is still going to run on shutting it down. You're going to hear that discussion be happening again about protecting the waters. There's a lot of constituent emails are coming in about Nestle taking up the water from the Great Lakes. So I think water will definitely stay central for the state of Michigan, most definitely. I also think that... Go for it, Trip.
Well, I was going to say, when you're in the Great Lakes state, can you never not think about water?
No, exactly. And I think that's something that is at the forefront of a lot of voters' minds because of the Flint water crisis, because of what's happening in Benton Harbor, because when you go to places in Pontiac and Ypsi, you want to drink filtered water and you want to not, be worried about it. And it exists. And it's definitely something that impacts the day-to-day life of people. So I think that comes back to like things that are impacting us every day. Healthcare decisions. Like if you're waking up not feeling good, but you don't have health insurance, you're thinking about that every day. And you're thinking about maybe today's the day that I can't get out of bed. And we shouldn't be doing that in the United States. That shouldn't still be. And I think that COVID showed a lot of people even more about the healthcare system. If you got severely sick and then you're going into the hospital without insurance, you're in a lot of trouble right now. Navigating if you can go get the vaccinations and the tests for free, figuring out where to go and get those at. I know I am 26, so I just got my own insurance, and finding a dental facility that takes my insurance has been one of the biggest struggles that I thought I wouldn't have to have. But like those are things that really are at the forefront of everyday life. And, I think about when you brought up education and again, the pandemic, I think parents started paying more attention to what was going on. They had their kids home, Zooming in the living room. They were hearing the lessons. They were seeing the homework more. And that's not true for every parent. For a lot of parents, they're very engaged right now. One of the things that we're seeing is people showing up at school board meetings full of opinions. And I think that we're going to continue seeing that go and even probably increase even more as we get election cycle.
Absolutely. And I think there's one other issue I did want to bring up is I think, economic standard of living and wages, I think, are going to definitely be a really important issue. You and Spencer are actually right now living that very much. You're out in front of the Kellogg factory in Battle Creek. But, across the country, we have seen workers staging walkouts, protests, the drives for unionization. I think people... workers are very upset about, how they were put under a lot of stress during the COVID pandemic, especially a lot more blue-collar workers who didn't have the luxury of working from home, didn't have the luxury of, being able to quarantine. And, they've seen their companies make massive profits in the last 18 months, but they have yet to see any of that trickle down to them. And so, I think from especially in workers in the service industry, workers in manufacturing, people who basically anyone who wasn't allowed, who couldn't work from home. So I would say a lot of blue collar middle class jobs. There's expectation of we put ourselves out there and on at risk. We were all heralded as heroes, but being heralded as a hero doesn't mean you get a pizza party. Heralded as a hero means you get paid a living wage, you get access to benefits. That the gains that these companies have seen because of the work their workers have done is invested back in them.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested to see if we've had this whole discussion about a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour or more, but I'd be interested to see that on the state level coming up as well. If people would be interested in that being a particular topic coming up with the elections.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's a fair thing when you're asking your representatives. Let's say a bill comes before the state legislature in Michigan. How are you going to vote? Are you going to vote to increase the minimum wage, or are you not? Are your special interest companies going to hold you accountable, or are the people of Michigan going to hold you accountable? These are definitely questions we need to be asking. Speaking of the legislature, are there any things that we should be specific watching right now as we have a few minutes left to discuss? Any bills we want to plug?
Oh boy. So right now I am very upset with House Bill 5097. I believe that's it. And Senate Bill 560. Both of these bills, the language is almost the same, and they are trying to ban the teaching of history as it happened in classrooms. They say in the bills that they're trying to prevent discrimination, that they're trying to prevent critical race theory from being taught in classes. And the people who spoke about this in support of these bills use very extreme examples. And so the issue with these bills other than the obvious, is that one, critical race theory isn't being taught in K through 12 schools, period, in the state of Michigan, period. That's not happening. But two, discrimination isn't being taught in schools either. And what they believe to be discrimination is really, if you look at the curriculum in the history classes that is being taught and that needs to be taught, it's focused on what happened in the past that led to certain actions. And so it's just very concerning that the Republicans want to hide that happened. And it's also going to make history very difficult to understand. They say that they can't teach that there is any discrimination or any imbalance of power between men and women. I believe it was Representative Regina Weiss who got up and said, well, how are you going to teach about the gender pay gap if you can't talk about the roles that gender play in it? It's just not possible. And she is an educator. The people who've come up with these bills are not educators. In fact, these bills are coming in from, think tanks in Washington, D.C., and they're being seen in other states. And so they've come to Michigan now, and they're coming for politicizing our classrooms and further politicizing the school boards. Those two bills are very frustrating to me. And it's something to keep an eye on because they're slowly working their way through the chambers.
Definitely. And I think, we're talking about elections and things that we can do. So, I think of a first step is if what Spencer just talked about is concerning to you guys, I would recommend that you email and call your senators and your House reps and state your opinion on these things. They definitely need to hear from us. But also, elections are coming up. This is our chance to replace those senators and House reps that are introducing these types of bills, and to protect our school boards, Board of Education, to make sure that we have good, strong representatives in those positions. Because, ultimately a lot of the curriculum decisions does come down from the Board of Education. And so having good people in the school boards and those types of things really help drive this conversation. And we're seeing parents engaged on these issues too. So we want to continue these conversations that we're seeing.
Absolutely. And I will just say we will be voting with new maps in 2022 that will have deconstructed the Republican gerrymander that has governed this state for the last 20 years in the legislature, which is going to make our legislature elections even more important than they were before. You know, these are new maps. That means new people are voting on new legislatures. A lot of things can happen. Another education bill that I wanted to touch on is also this bill that Governor Whitmer just vetoed, but Republicans are trying to pass a petition for him, which would basically create a charter school system, a workaround for a charter school voucher system here in the state of Michigan. And Michigan voters have repeatedly been asked this question on statewide initiative: do you want to start a voucher system, charter school system? And they've consistently, by large margins, rejected those ballot initiatives. The Republicans are basically pushing a bill that would say if you give, money to certain scholarship funds for vouchers for charter schools and private schools, that would count as a tax-free rate, and you would be able to write that off come your taxes. And the nonpartisan Michigan kind of budget office said this could cost the state upwards of $500 million. So this will allow people like Betsy DeVos to spend millions of dollars on funding private schools and vouchers for private schools, and will take millions of dollars away from our public schools, and will continue to cripple and hurt our public school system. And, Michiganders, they're very proud of their public schools. They're very proud of our support for public schools and K through 12, and the wonderful state institutions we have here, like Michigan State, the directional universities like Eastern and Central and Western, and Michigan Tech and Northwest Michigan. And I think that, this is another way to underfund and hurt our public school systems that will only hurt them going forward. This is just a way for wealthy people to give themselves a huge tax break by donating to private and charter schools and hurting our public school system. And I think that's something that, they're trying that ballot petition workaround system that they're doing with the voter rights bills that we talked about earlier. That's something that I think is very worrying.
Definitely. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I think we've had some really good discussions today. Spencer, I'd like to turn to you as our guest today for your parting words of wisdom. If you can. Are you still muted? There we go.
Yeah, I really think it's important that we look to hold our leaders accountable. We elect them, and we hold them accountable on the municipal level, county level, state level, the national level. Once they realize that we're watching, and once they realize that we're going to pay attention and act on what we see, I think we can really see some change. We've got these new maps too. I think the most important thing I can say off of all that is to go out and vote, figure out how to help people, learn how to vote absentee, in person, but just go out and vote and stay on top of what's happening.
Awesome. Thank you, Trip, for co-hosting today, and thank you, Spencer, for being out here at Kellogg and taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate all the work you guys do. Stay tuned for more info coming from Young Dems from diving to young politics. Almost said Young Dems of Michigan. And we'll see you guys next weekend for some more updates of what's happening in Michigan and throughout the nation. So thank you guys so much. Have an awesome weekend. Trip, Spencer, be safe out there. And I will tell you, thanks for watching.